Okay, paper for today is going to continue our theme of starting with the review on weightlifting in general, and then after that, focusing on the biomechanics of specific lifts. And today will be on my favorite exercise, the squat. And that's why I had squats with an exclamation point here in my notes. You may not know it from looking at my skinny little legs, but squats are my favorite exercise. I think it's the best exercise for overall lower body strength and for performance in most sports. Again, of course, not every sport, and very few things generalize to all sports. But I think in most sports, leg strength is important and is certainly beneficial for performance in a large number of sports. There aren't too many sports, I think, where you're not going to benefit from increasing the muscular strength of your lower body. And squats are one of the best exercises for affecting that strength. This is a brief review article on the kinetics and kinematics of squatting and their relationship to exercise performance. Author is Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, who's a well-known fitness professional and expert in weight training and strength and conditioning. This paper is in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. I like this journal because, unlike a lot of scholarly journals that publish articles like this, like most of those journals, it of course targets a scientific audience, so people who work people like me, like professors who work professionally as scientists. But it also has a heavy focus on targeting practitioners, athletes themselves, coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, people that work professionally in that field, working with actual athletes and actual coaches of those athletes. And so in this particular journal and journals like it, you'll often see a little bit more of an emphasis on the practical take-home messages and then what are the implications here for actually doing this thing in practice. So this goes over. It's a nice review that covers and summarizes a lot of different research that's been done on the biomechanics of squatting and kind of the key topics that if I was going to concisely summarize what it focuses on here, are on the setup of the squat, positioning of different parts of your body and where you put the barbell and things like that, and the actual execution of the squat and how those choices can affect the loads on certain parts of the body and the distribution of effort among the many muscle groups involved in the squat. I wanted to first cover a biomechanics issue, and I'm actually going to revise my order in which I cover things here. We're going to move this basis support business up here to the top. I first wanted to cover just kind of some general squatting biomechanics issues here. The paper goes over a number of kind of selections or choices or adjustments that the performer of the squat has to choose. For example, you choose the width of your stance. You choose where you place the barbell, for example, whether it's like resting up high on your traps or down a little bit lower around your shoulder blades. And those are all choices that the person performing the squat has to make. You then have some decisions that you have to make in terms of the biomechanics of the motion. Do you do it with a large amount of trunk flexion, or do you try to keep your trunk kind of upright? And what are the consequences of those choices, or what are you affecting when you make those decisions? Let's go to my whiteboard here and draw a little diagram just to kind of illustrate that issue there. So first I'm going to draw this just for upright standing, and then we will extend this to squatting after we get those basics down. So here's my ground here, and then I'm going to draw a person standing on that ground there. So there's their foot, and this would be their ankle here, and they've got a knee there and an ankle there, and then up here, and we've got a hip, and then we've got our torso / upper body, and then we've got our head here. Okay. So this person is able to generate a ground reaction force under their feet, and that ground reaction force, kind of by its definition of being a contact force between the person's foot and between the ground, has to exist somewhere along the physical boundaries of the foot here, right? So if I draw my ground reaction force in red here, this person's ground reaction force, for example, could be right here, because that's still under their feet. It could not be out here, right? Because they don't have a means of generating that force. There's no part of the foot there to actually apply to the ground and produce that force. Okay, so your ground reaction force has to exist somewhere within the physical boundaries of your part of your body that's generating that force, which in this case is your foot. So it could exist anywhere from the very tip of your toes here, up or back through the very back of your heels there. Okay, so that boundary there, which I'm going to try and draw in this red dotted line here, my ground reaction force can exist anywhere within that dotted red boundary, and that region there and between the heel of my foot and the toe tip of my foot, that's my base of support, or that's the area within which, based on how I move my body and how I position my body segments and how I use my muscles to press my feet into the ground, is where physically my ground reaction force could possibly exist. Okay? That ground reaction force points upward from the ground, and then I also, due to gravity, have pointing downward, acting on my center of mass, which maybe is somewhere around here in blue, have gravity acting downward on me. Okay? So that's the effect of gravity there in blue acting on my center of mass. Okay? And this ground reaction force within this base of support and this gravity, or this weight acting on my center of mass, interact to affect the dynamic equilibrium, or the mechanical equilibrium of my body. For example, when I'm just standing on the ground, I'm standing still because my ground reaction force is equal and opposite magnitude to the force of gravity acting on me. And that's why when I stand still, I don't fly into the air or sink into the ground, because those forces are balancing each other out. But what I've drawn here would actually not be in equilibrium, because while this blue gravity, this blue weight, and this red ground reaction force are equal in magnitude and opposite in direction, they are not lining up exactly in the sagittal plane here, meaning my ground reaction force here, the red line in the vertical direction, is not lined up directly under my center of mass. Okay? So what would happen here, if I continue drawing the line of action of this ground reaction force upward like that, notice that its line of action acts a non-zero distance here from my center of mass. And so take that ground reaction force times that moment arm there, and that ground reaction force is going to produce a clockwise torque about my center of mass that's going to tend to try to topple me on my back there. Right? So this person, in order to actually stand still, if I can get my eraser going here, they would have to actually lean forward a little bit at their hips or through some other combination of body motions to get their center of mass directly under or directly above their ground reaction force, so that those forces cancel out in magnitude, and also so that the torques they generate about the center of mass cancel out. Okay? More realistically, this is kind of a contrived example that I drew here, but more realistically, this person would be standing up and down like this, and their center of mass would typically be somewhere in the hip region here, and acting downward like that. And then through adjusting my mechanics of my body and my activity of my muscles while I'm standing, I'd be generating a ground reaction force that acts directly under my center of mass there to balance those things out, so that the ground reaction force is not producing a torque about my center of mass, and I can stand still statically like that. So that's just for standing still. Now let's extend this to squatting with a barbell on our back. So this is getting kind of messy. I'm just going to erase this whole thing here and start over. Oh, where did that go? My whole app closed. There we go. How do I delete this stupid thing? View. Undo. There we go. All right. Okay. So let's extend this now to squatting. And now I've got somebody that, suppose they're in the deepest portion of a squat. And they're going to look something like this. Not much of an artist, sorry, but hopefully you can kind of get the sense of it here. Now I've got, say, this barbell on my back. And that's going to affect, of course, the magnitude of the gravitational force that's acting on me. Now it's going to be my body weight plus the weight of the barbell. And it's also going to affect the location of my center of mass. The barbell, in this case, for a strong exercise like a squat, is typically a pretty substantial amount of weight and is having a pretty large effect on where your center of mass might actually go. So basically, your center of mass is going to move in the direction of wherever the barbell is. It won't necessarily be, directly underneath the barbell, but it'll be, somewhere probably in that direction. So let's assume this person's center of mass is now here, around the barbell. And now they've got this gravitational force acting down on them. And to balance that out, both in terms of not sinking into the ground and in terms of not toppling over and losing balance, they would have to generate a ground reaction force equal in magnitude and opposite in direction. That's a little bit crooked, sorry. Let me draw that better. You'd have to generate a ground reaction force equal in magnitude, opposite in direction, and again, lined up directly with the center of mass. Okay? So I draw that, I point that out here because the article goes over the effects of lots of different nuances that you can choose when you squat. You have to choose, for example, the depth of the squat that you go to. You have to choose where you position the barbell, whether it's up high on your back or down low on your back. Kind of coupled with that, you make some choices on the mechanics of the motion, whether you lean your trunk forward appreciably with a good bit of trunk flexion, like you see this athlete doing here, or, for example, whether you keep the trunk more upright and more inclined backwards. And you can see here the effect that choice would have, where let's suppose this person was doing a squat with their trunk more upright, like this. And now here's my barbell back here somewhere. And again, the center of mass probably isn't, lined up directly under the barbell, but it's probably somewhere in that region, fairly close to it. So let's suppose my center of mass is now here, and then I draw that downwards. And in this situation, I'm going to lose my balance, right? If I have my ground reaction force clear out on my toes here, and my weight due to gravity and due to the weight of the barbell is clear behind me there, more back and behind my ankle joint. So in this case, I'm going to have to take my ground reaction force, and it's going to have to be in a very different place than where it was with my trunk leaned forward like that. Now it's got to be back here to keep my balance. Okay. So notice something that happens when I make those changes for something like that for this exercise for the squat. If I have my trunk upright versus if I have my trunk inclined forward. So let's take a look there, and just to keep things simple here, I'm going to clean this up a bit and erase the weight due to gravity there, just so we can kind of visualize things in a more focused fashion here. Sorry, I downloaded this drawing program like 5 minutes ago because my normal drawing program wasn't doing what I wanted it to do, and so I'm kind of learning as I go how to use this stinking thing. Okay, so I'm generating this ground reaction force, and to generate that force, I activate the muscles that span, my main joints here, my hip and my knee and my ankle. That presses my foot into the ground and generates that ground reaction force. So that ground reaction force is generated by the forces that my muscles produce that generate moments or torques at those joints that then result in pressing that foot into the ground and generating that ground reaction force that's going to counter the weight of gravity and press my center of mass and press the weight upwards against gravity and actually perform the squat and perform the lift here. So we can calculate the torques from muscles that we have to have at our joints to produce this ground reaction force and complete that lift against gravity there. So let's just focus on the knee joint here, which I'll highlight there in blue. So that's my knee joint. And torques that I generate about that joint are going to be due to my quadriceps muscles, my three vasti muscles, and my rectus femoris muscle. And so notice here, with my trunk leaned backwards like that, my ground reaction force has to be closer to my heels than to my toes. And here's my line of action for that ground reaction force. And then here in blue is my moment arm for the knee joint. So take this red ground reaction force times this blue knee joint moment arm, and that's the torque that your quadriceps muscles at your knee has to generate to produce that ground reaction force. Okay? So pretty long moment arm there. Okay? Now let's consider what this looks like if I then go back to my original case of having the trunk inclined forwards pretty far. Okay, here I'm doing the same lift with the same weight, but I've got my trunk leaned forward or flexed forward a lot further. Okay, so now my barbell is about here, and maybe my center of mass is about here, and now my gravitational vector is right about there. And so to avoid losing my balance, now my ground reaction force, now I don't want it here, closer to my heel, I want it up here, closer to my toe. So let's draw that, and that'll look something like this. And then let's draw the line of action for that force. And then the distance from that line of action to my knee joint center is this little blue dotted line there. So notice by making that change in having my trunk relatively upright in the former case, versus in this current case, having the trunk inclined forward further, notice how much shorter I've made my moment arm, or my external moment arm, either moment arm due to gravity or moment arm due to ground reaction force, either one. Notice how much shorter that moment arm is to the center of my knee joint. Okay? Meaning the same weight here, at the same portion of the squat, the deepest part of my squat motion here, is going to produce a smaller torque about my knee joint when I'm leaned forward here compared to when I'm leaned back further, because of the length of this moment arm here. It's the same weight in both cases, but in one case I've leaned forward, where I now need a smaller torque about my knee joint and smaller forces from my quadriceps muscles. And in the other case, I've leaned backwards, making the moment arm longer to the knee and requiring more force more torque at the knee and more force from my quadriceps muscles. That's the effect in general of most of your choices here on the setup for the squat. This is just the sagittal plane, but you can envision a similar thing in like the frontal plane if you take this model and twist it sideways so that you're now looking at it at the front, and you have to make a choice on like the width of the squat, whether your feet are real close together, whether they're more like shoulder width or even further. That'll affect the distance of your centers of your joints from the weight of the barbell in the frontal plane, which also involves the effect of muscles and loads on different parts of the body and things of that nature. And so this is really mechanically what's going on when you make your decisions on the setup of the squat, on the positioning of your feet, the positioning of the barbell, the mechanics that you use, like for example here, whether the trunk is inclined further forwards or lean back further. That's really the biomechanical effect that the squat exercise is having. Most people, I think, when they're doing a squat, whether it's for sporting performance purposes or bodybuilding purposes or whatever, it's an exercise that affects a lot of that stresses a lot of the muscle groups throughout the lower limb. But I think it's in most cases, and most people I would say are doing it primarily as like a quadriceps exercise. And so if you want to, target the quadriceps, then that will have an effect, or that will be affected by the setup of the weight that you use, where you position it on your back, and the actual mechanics of the lift that you actually do. So going back to my comment a couple lectures ago on increasing the weight on the bar to progress and increasing the reps that you're doing, but through that making it important and emphasizing a maintenance of the quality of the reps, right? Like if my goal is to stimulate and stress the quadriceps muscles, if I'm adding weight and adding reps, but in doing that I'm leaning forwards further, or just more generally I'm altering my form in a way that's actually reducing the load on my quadriceps muscles and maybe loading up other joints, like it's placing more stress on my calf muscles or more stress on my hip muscles. That might be fine if my goal is, overall strengthening of the leg muscles. But if I'm specifically trying to target the quadriceps muscles, I might be fooling myself here in thinking I'm progressing by adding weight to the bar and adding reps, but compromising the quality of my reps in a way that I'm no longer placing as much stress on my muscle groups, or maybe I'm actually maintaining the total stress that's on them, but increasing the reps in a way that I'm kind of fooling myself and thinking, oh, I'm doing more when I'm actually not doing more, maybe actually doing a little bit less. So things to keep in mind here as you're progressing. It depends on the goal and depends on the actual form that you're using to achieve that goal. Last comment I wanted to make here is something that the author focuses on fairly early in the movement, and this is the role of the ankle joint. We don't typically think of the squat as being like an ankle-heavy exercise. This is something that I find varies from person to person. Like when I do squats, I don't feel basically any engagement or effort from my ankle muscles. To me, it's all hip and lower back and quads. I don't feel much in my ankle. But then I know some people that seem to get a lot of stimulation of the ankle muscles and the calf muscles when they're doing a squat. So it varies a lot from person to person. Another thing that varies quite a bit from person to person that might explain that is the flexibility of the ankle joints. I did a lot of distance running when I was a younger man, and distance running tends to stiffen up your ankles a little bit. There's some studies that say that actually stiffer ankles are better for performance in distance running, and so maybe I was never a particularly good runner, but maybe it's a consequence of that type of training that I did for a long time, that my ankle flexibility is not all that good. Ankle flexibility can be a limiting factor in squats in terms of the depth that you can get to for the squat, and also in terms of the options that you have for positioning your body, especially in deep parts of the squat, to get the focus of the movement onto particular muscle groups. I happen to be in the right place here just through fortune, but the comment that the author makes in the article is when ankle flexibility is compromised, there's a tendency for the heels to rise off the floor at higher degrees of flexion of the knee there. And he notes that to keep your heels down into a full squat requires about 40 degrees of dorsiflexion at the ankle, which is, you can check this on yourself. That's a decent amount of flexibility at the ankle to get into like a full deep squat without your heels coming off of the ground. Now, why do we not want that? Why do we not want our heels coming off the ground? Well, imagine the heel lifts off the ground here. Then I'm kind of forced to have this ground reaction force up, closer to the front of my foot here. And as we saw in the drawing, moving my ground reaction force forward, that shortens the moment arm to my knee and reduces the distribution of the effort there onto my quadriceps, which is typically what most people are trying to target when they're doing a squat exercise. So let's just look at one final example here. And this will take me a second, sorry. Still learning how to use my new drawing program here. But let's take a look at an example here of what a squat might look like with a flexible ankle versus a not so flexible ankle. Okay, so let's get my ground drawn again there in green. And here's my foot. And let's suppose somebody has a real flexible ankle. Let's suppose they can get like 45 degrees or so of dorsiflexion there. Okay. Then for them, if they get into even a moderately deep amount of knee flexion there, it's pretty possible to get into a fairly deep squat there while still keeping my trunk fairly upright. Okay. And I don't mean to go through this lecture trying to, give heuristics here like, oh, when you're squatting, you should try to keep the trunk upright. Leaning the trunk forward is bad form in squatting. That's not the case. Leaning the trunk forward is okay in squatting. Lots of people do lots of good squats and lots of effective squats and effective training by inclining the trunk forward. You don't necessarily need to keep the trunk upright for it to be a quote unquote good squat or to target the quadriceps or whatever. But the ability to make that decision or to make that choice is important. You want to be able to have the option of doing a squat with a less inclined trunk or with a more flexed trunk, and that's where a lack of ankle flexibility can limit you. You may be limited in your ability to adopt different types of squatting or different mechanics of squatting, whether you want to or not, if your ankle flexibility is limited. So notice this in this diagram here, this person is able to get into that deep squatted posture with a fairly upright trunk because they have good ankle flexibility there. Let's suppose, maybe I can just undo here. Yeah, that's a lot better. Let's suppose now that we have somebody, we'll do an extreme case with somebody that has really bad ankle flexibility, where now they can't go very far. Now, even if they want to get to like 90 degrees of knee flexion, which is not a terribly deep squat, okay, if they do that and try to keep their trunk upright here, and then they've got a barbell on their back here that, you know, weighs a couple 100 pounds or so, then they've got this big old heavy gravity vector back there, and there's no possible way they can stay upright for that, right? Even if they move their ground reaction force clear back as far as possible on their heels, they're nowhere close to being lined up with their center of mass there, and this person will fall over quite easily. This is not a stable posture here. So what would this person have to do to be able to even hold that posture with their lack of ankle flexibility here? Well, they would have to incline their trunk forward real far like that, right? So here's my weight. Here's my center of mass, roughly. Here's my gravity vector. And then here I can position my ground reaction force like that. Okay, so that would be a stable posture, but to achieve it with my lack of ankle flexibility, I had to get that motion from somewhere else in the body, and it had to come from my trunk there. And this person, you can kind of envision from the diagram here, suppose they wanted to get into to even deeper squats. The deeper they squat here, the further back that center of mass is going to go, and the more forward, even further and further, they're going to have to incline that trunk to in order to get into that posture. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but generally for squatting, if you want to target the quadriceps there, that's going to be a detrimental thing. You're going to be limited in your ability to adopt those different mechanics of the squat and trying to put the emphasis on different muscle groups if you're lacking in that ankle flexibility. And so that can be something that's often that the author highlights here that is often a limiting factor in people's ability to use certain mechanics in squats or to progress in squats. So working on ankle flexibility can often open up some additional flexibility there in terms of options for using different mechanics in a motion like that. Okay, that is it for today, and we will move ahead next time on to a more specific study on some of the biomechanics of squatting, an examination of a more specific issue in the mechanics of squatting and the decisions on the mechanics of performing the squat.